when white men when white men finally start achieving, like, okay, they're getting it, it's like bam, he gets killed, right? Like, or like they die. And I just find it to be so interesting, and like the way that Hollywood, and like cinema and the culture, pop culture, tells that story. I find to be interesting.
I really appreciate. I know Camille is next on the stack, but I appreciate how media is explored throughout the book, and I know in earlier chapters when she talks about violence and just how like we're groomed to celebrate male violence through movies like Independence Day and see men being isolated and sent off to war as something to celebrate. And I love that she just brings all of these moments that I loved Independence Day, but it has definitely made me look back like, ooh, I guess that is problematic. And I had the same thought with American Beauty. Camille, you were next.
Thank you. So the quote that stuck out to me is on page 97 in the book. And she says, many men use work as the place where they can flee from the self, from emotional awareness, where they can lose themselves and operate from a space of emotional numbness. Unemployment feels so emotionally threatening because it means that there would be no time to fill, and most men in patriarchal culture do not want time on their hands. And I just thought this chapter was so revealing to me about the nature of how how we make it harder for men to find themselves and to have free time and to have that space where you can find your purpose that's outside of just working to survive. And I just thought it was interesting because just the other day, this guy had said to me, he was like, you have peace of mind. And I was wondering, what does he mean by that? And it was funny, as I was reading this, I was like seeing how him, like so many other men that I've known in my life, are just like, they don't take the time and don't take the time to themselves to find their own purpose. And I think part of finding purpose is that, like, that quiet time and that peace of mind, as he was calling it. And so I was relating to this chapter in the sense that I feel like, although I think it has been hard to find my own purpose and to take that path, I'm recognizing how it would have been a lot harder if I was a man, and just how oppressive that I'm realizing that can be for men. And so it just felt like, yeah, opening to that understanding.
I appreciate you saying that, Camille, because I honestly had a little bit of trouble with that concept because I feel like in the many of the experiences I've had, I feel like men in my life have been given a lot of grace to figure it out. And, I think about oftentimes everybody has an uncle who's lived with their grandmother forever and no one seems to mind, even though he is so grown, right? But like the daughter, the oldest daughter, it's like, what are you doing? You're not in school, you don't have a job, why don't you have a third job? And I just and so I had a little bit of tension with this idea that as a culture we force men to figure it out, and it kind of aligned with on page 93. I have the physical book where it says masses of men in our culture. This is like in the middle of the paragraph. Masses of men in our culture may believe that their ability to provide for themselves and their families is a measure of their manhood. yet they often do not actually use these resources to provide for others. And it just, you know, and I know the uncle who stays with the grandmother is the stereotype, but I did notice a lot of y'all were nodding, so maybe not. So I just, you know, I just wanted to throw that out there because I was really like, we don't give men time to figure it out. I feel like we give men all of the time to figure it out, and it's women who were like, you have children, or you should have your shit together, like figure it out. Whereas I just think we give men more time. But I see, and let me just make sure that I'm reading this right. I see Annabelle on, yes, I see Annabelle and Stack, and then Ian after her.
Cool. Yeah, I actually had, that was, you brought up the exact part that I was about to quote too, so that's perfect. Like that really resonated. We had a star next to that. Masculinity and culture. But also just a section where you kind of quotes that in a lot of cases, men use this guise of showing up for and sustaining the community and the family and being these providers when like research would show otherwise. Like if we look at money that is actually being allocated, like who has limited resources and like when does it go back to the community as if it's in the hands of women, generally speaking. And this is of course not always true, but like there are a lot of movements that try to stabilize like communities that find the most effectiveness if they educate women, because if you can educate women to get higher earning jobs, then they're the ones who tend to give it back to the community. If men got educated, they fucking leave, you know, like, so that's not always true, but that's like a stereotype for a reason too. And so before, like when I was first reading this book, I was talking with my friend Kiana about like, it's really hard for us to make some space for people who have continually done so many harmful things and that we've been so time and time again just so forgiving of in so many ways. And so this book, I resonated with what both of you shared big time, because I think that there are a lot of things that I have the like privilege of overlooking even as a non-binary person. Like I have been raised femme, so like I am conditioned to be allowed to give myself a moment, and that's something that I don't, even if people ridicule me for it, it's not like against the paradigm as well. So there's another layer that I'm not having to sift through, that this is shedding light on, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Annabelle. I know Ian was next on Stack.
Yes, thank you. So many excellent points, and I wanted to, you know, the part that David mentioned about the films really struck me because it seemed to tie in with this idea of rebirth, and there seems to be this undercurrent. What I've read thus far, it's kind of thin, although you look at the cover and you read the quote about alchemy, and she mentions awakening here and there, and one thing that really struck me is this kind of idea of the hero's journey. That's implicit to this, and that, you know, in these films in which, you know, this man, you know, kind of operates from this programmatic space, going through the process of discovering what is of true value and then dying, obviously limited within 2 hours versus a life. It's very different, but it's like that, you know, what Joseph Campbell calls like the call to adventure. The process of going from a life that is based on externals into a life, into the journey inward, which is really what the hero's journey is about, and discovering what the gold is, right? Having operated from this other place, speaks to what, you know, for me, what Def was mentioning, which is like how the pandemic, from like a more global perspective and the time out, what it's really challenging about the kind of leaden life that we've been living, which is this conversation about doing versus being, right? Which is a part of like the spiritual evolution that I think we're all trying to realize here, those of us who have incarnated at this time, is to learn how to be, instead of having our value as individuals, our value as a collective being judged by the doing, which is very problematic because of the ways in which it separates. So, thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Were there more quotes from this chapter that folks wanted to highlight?
I have one more. Also, it kind of ties into what you were saying, Hollis, and part of, because I also shared that kind of resistance with reading this. I was actually having a conversation with my mom right before this call where we were talking about like the parentification of daughters and how sons kind of get waited on a lot of times in families of color, whereas the daughters are literally like working as an effort to maintain a household or whatever in their childhood. And I was reading this and just kind of like, I don't know if I really agree with that. But I had to acknowledge that there is like a socioeconomic lens that some feminist like ideology is born through that I just would not be able to relate to just because of where I'm from. And I think most people of color have that dynamic, because although like we are from families where men are supposed to provide, generally the need for money and like the need to survive like outweighs all of that. Like everybody has to work typically, and if men are not willing to work, the women are like always kind of like required to be like the bigger person and like carry the strength that the men could not do. So that like realizing the socioeconomic thing, the way that capitalism and patriarchy work together, has helped me in understanding this. And then this quote that I was looking at kind of goes into that, where it is, for me, it's on page 141. Again, it's the Apple book, so I don't know. It's probably a little earlier for you guys, but it says, working class and middle income women I have spoken with talk about the extent to which working outside the home after years of staying home bolstered their self-esteem and provided them with a different perspective on relationships. And then it goes on to say, like a paragraph later, that most women who work long hours come home and work a second shift taking care of household chores. They feel like their male counterparts, that there is no time to do emotional work, to share feelings, to nurture others. Like their male counterparts, they may simply want to rest. And earlier in this chapter, it was also talking about how men expressed a discontentment with the work that they were doing prior to feminist theory even existing. So this pretty much, like, to me, it's saying like women, when they were able to work, there was a self-esteem boost. However, everyone really just seems tired of this whole dynamic anyways. And I was questioning then, can the work be empowering technically? Is that feeling of empowerment, that feeling, that self-esteem boost that women got from being able to join the workforce, is that true empowerment, or was it just kind of like a high on having a taste of that capitalistic power? Like, can work be empowering? I feel like for me, the work that I do, I am empowered by it, but I feel like what makes it empowering could exist. Like, I would be doing it if it was not work. The fact that I do it in exchange for money is because I literally have to in order to live. So is it possible for working in exchange for money can you feel truly empowered by that in a sustainable way? Is it empowered by that? Cheers. Okay, so Annabelle, I think that's the first one in the stack. Oh, actually, sorry, Danielle.
Oh, I think she was saying picking up the
yeah, when you were saying how women, how they, but
yes.
no, by all means.
Indeed. So then Annabelle.
It's Jeff. We're just in the same space. But the question you just asked, can work be empowering? I love this, and I'm gonna meditate on it for the rest of the week. But here's the hot take, the spicy one, is that that's artist's job. Like, the artist is to investigate, can work be empowering? And that's the work. Massaging that question is like asking the questions for humanity, the conscious, like, it's asking the hard questions and being like, what does that look like? Can it be empowering? And it ends up being empowering by us continuing to ask these questions and continuing to like sit with the uncomfortable and try to give words to the wordless. It's like the hard, nasty stuff is what artists are doing. It's not these paintings, and it's not this rap music. It's like, what are we doing here? Like that's what we're here to do. And that's exciting and priceless, you know? And so it's always this weird exchange that's happening. And I think we can even look at hip hop music in this era as like this, like, I feel like we can be modern day philosophers, but at the same time, it's so by design, the things that people are talking about, that we never actually get to the real questions. So there's like this surface level talk. And just like they said in the chapter, that when men get together, it's like trivial conversation. And I thought, like, that hits so hard. Like, that hits so hard. It's like we talk about the sports team, the weather, who are you seeing, or, you know, whatever. Like, what about how you feel? And I think that the choice to live as an artist in capitalism is that choice to wonder your question. And sometimes someone gives you an opportunity to talk about it or to exchange something for it. And if you've done it long enough, somehow that has value, you know? It's still not fair value, but I do think work can be empowering. And I think there's work in wondering, is that empowering? And I love that question. So that's the hot take, because you just sparked me up. But I'd love to hear more people on that.
I saw Aja and then Betsaida in the stack.
Hey everyone. Yeah, I think so. There's like multiple things going through my brain at this time, a lot like moving, shifting, and jumbling around. But when the question around is rest a form of resistance, I think, you know, there's this group like NAP ministry that is a big thing, and I really love and believe in rest. I believe wholeheartedly in rest. Rest is a part of my creative practice, you know. But I also feel like part of my battle with the discussion around like rest versus labor is, you know, participation in society and understanding like who's resting at the expense of who, and like where's the balance of power and labor lie. And I think part of the question that Bell Hooks brings up when she quotes Dean Ornish on page 103 is like, if the intention behind the work is to seek recognition and power and be like, hey, look at me, I'm special, I'm important, I'm worthy of your love and respect, then you are setting yourself apart from others as a way of trying to feel connected to them, setting yourself apart from others as a way of trying, it seems so clear why this is self-defeating, and yet it is the norm, often the norm in our culture, when my self-worth was defined by what I did, and I had to take every important opportunity that came along, even if relationships suffered. And I feel like capitalism does reward a certain performance of labor and certain ways that we see productivity look a certain way. And that's where, like, I think women start to bring in this conversation oftentimes around emotional labor and what does that look like. But like with anything, I think there has to be a level of balance. And I think that sometimes we can go too far one way or too far the other, because things need to be done for society to run. You know, people need to clean up, people need to drive, people need to, you know, make things happen. We need mechanics, we need plumbers, there's practical things that need to be done in order for society to function in a certain way. And I think there are certain people that are often left doing those jobs, that are expected to do those jobs even. And I think there's an assumption that physical labor or certain jobs are men jobs, right? There are certain jobs that are women jobs. And that's what I think she's starting to try to get us to question, like, why and what is the real function of the jobs being gendered? Like, what does that mean? And then what does distribution of different types of labor look like? I think what women brought to the forefront that transformed my idea of labor is like, what is reproductive labor? What does it mean to be people who actually birth the workforce? And what is the investment in making sure they're continuing to birth the workforce so that things can run as they do? And what happens when women start to decide not to become sort of these channels of just creating workers, but deciding to have their own dreams and goals and ideas and like life? You know, these are all questions that are like running through my head while I'm reading this, because I think there's no one clear answer. But I think what's beautiful about what Def said, that I feel very privileged to have as an artist, which is a gift and a curse, is that being an artist affords you the opportunity and the time to contemplate. And essentially, when all of us get into the workforce, what we start to sell is our time. That's kind of what makes us slaves, right? So when you get a job, you get paid for an hour of your time. And then the real question is, what is an hour of your life worth? And how do we, why are we fighting still in this country to say that an hour of a person's life is worth at the very least $15? You know, we're still arguing to say minimum wage should be $15, which is disgusting. Like, people can't even live off of that. So I don't know. I think there's like these things that are, this is bringing up around what is money? How can money validate and affirm what work we do? But then what are the things that we do that there is no value, there's no numerical value for? And I think artists have often been in this weird, that's why I think James Baldwin and other people have said artists are so dangerous, because they move in and out of certain, you know, economic backgrounds, and they have this ability to be broke as hell one moment, which is a privilege in some moments. And then in another moment, they're eating, you know, filet mignon with so-and-so, and they're having this spectrum of experience that allows them to then have this sort of outside look in to society and how work and labor force is really seen. So it's like, there's, you know, there's all these layers that she's bringing up that are gendered and not gendered. It's also about capitalism. And capitalism uses, I think, patriarchy and gender to like whip us into groupings and make us feel in competition with each other around things that we all humanely need and want to have, have some sustainability around. So yeah, that was something that came up for me. So much came up for me around this, but yes.
That was just one thing, just one. No, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. That cider was next in the stack, I believe.
Wow, that was beautiful, and thank you for sharing that. I think my train of thought went in a similar direction as far as the dynamics and how it gets separated, but I was thinking more in terms of what Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed describes, and how, again, in capitalism, we have this dynamic where we separate thinking from work, and you have the people that have the ideas at the top, you know, that get paid these extravagant amount of money, and you have the people that are actually doing the work, assuming that they're not doing any thinking, getting paid like barely enough to get by, if even that. And so to the question of, is there thought in work? I think there is. I think there always is, because even if you know, I don't know, flipping burgers or working in a factory, there is a certain type, like when you get good, when you enjoy, you know, the mundane tasks of life, like brushing your teeth or making your bed or cleaning up a little bit after yourself. I think that there's a certain type of flow state that you go into, which is what, again, Annabelle and Def were saying about artistry. So I definitely do think that there's always a thought process. There's always some ideas going on, even in the most mundane activities that we do, whether it's quote unquote just flipping burgers, or all the way in academia researching and trying to find vaccines and things like that. I think that there is definitely a lot of thinking that goes on, and that is influenced by our own experiences, by our own positions in social hierarchies. So all that to say, yes.
Thank you for that. Helen and Annabelle.
Hey y'all. I just wanted to share a personal anecdote because that comment that you made, Hollis, about everybody knows an uncle living in your grandmama's house, that really set me off on just like a mental tangent, because I was like, damn, like, do we really? And I feel like that's so right. And I was just like having a conversation with my mom, and my mom's a Dominican woman. She's she's a middle child, but like she's one of the eldest daughters, and her sister is the eldest daughter, and they both came to Miami, where I'm from, and they basically maintain all of my family in DR, and mostly they're all men. So like she like works at she's like a telesales agent. She sells healthcare on the phone and works tirelessly, and basically her whole like life is like for her family basically, but she kind of, that comes at the expense of like obviously her own happiness and her own joy and her own rest and her own pleasure. And it's like basically she just works and then sends money to basically take care of all of like all my uncles, and not just my uncles, their children, their wives, etc., etc. So it just really, like, reading this feels so personal, because they also, like, while they work, they don't work as much as my mom works, but when they do work, it's like they don't use their money to maintain their family. And so like that's what Bell Hooks was talking about on here too, in chapter 6, was like, and I'm just like, why? Like, why? How did we get here? Why don't men have the same response to be like, hey, I made this money, like, why don't I feed my children? And it's like, we know that it's not like a biological thing. We know that like everybody has the ability to care for others, but like, why? Like, I guess we know, you know, right? Like the way we're socialized, but like, how do we undo that is, I guess, more so what I'm saying. And why do they turn to, because it's like they spend their money, if it's on their family, they spend their money on drugs, alcohol, living in the streets, being unfaithful. That's like what they spend their money on. And so it's like Caribbean men, you know? So it's just like, how do we, like, what do we do to like repair and like transform that kind of behavior, especially as we're like thinking about our sons and our grandchildren and all of that. I don't want my brother to turn out the same way that my uncles did, you know? So just like wondering how we can transform that kind of behavior pattern. And I'll pass it on to, I think,
Annabelle.
Annabelle's next.
And then Kristen.
Hey, yeah, I super appreciate that share. And I think it's like, I was thinking about like, okay, what might be behind people feeling, women specifically feeling more joy when they get to go to work, like as opposed to what we were talking about with men coming home. And of course, everyone being exhausted, but there being like this notable difference when women did start to become a part of the workforce. And it reminded me of this course I took a long time ago called Environmental Psychology, that was like about our interpretation of space and holding up and taking up different physical spaces and how there's power in that. And that a lot of the time, like intermarital disputes that happen between two people who are married, regardless of gender, if one of them gets to go out and leave the house, they get to have new thoughts, they get to interact with new people, new spaces, new ideas, and reworld their mentality in that moment. And even if it's like the pressure of having to like put on a face or something, like in some way it might like give us also the opportunity to then be a new person for each new stranger we get to interact with. And I think there's a lot of power to that. And there's opportunity there, at least. Like it might be really draining, but it also has like this chance of like new becoming of self. Like you can tell this stranger some totally made up shit if you want. Like you can be whoever you want to or need to in that moment. And there's kind of a like therapy in that, even if it's out of circumstances that are really challenging. And yeah, it was interesting, like looking at that, like I have both of my parents, but also like my step parents, they all worked. And so I think that there is like definitely there is so much that's programmed that is gendered, but there's also people who are like I noticed like my dad having to come home and do all this stuff because, you know, he was just really like present with his family, whereas like my stepmom was really absent, like just was not able to be present. And so I saw that, and I was also like, I think it's there's so much that's programmed, but there's also a lot that's very personal, and it just kind of depends on like how committed you are to your own emotional capacities, because like stepdad absolutely was like all of this chapter, like 100% accurate. But like with my dad, it was like, he's so emotionally available that like he would yearn to come home and be with his kids. So I felt like, yeah, there's like so much to observe and also like unpack. And I'm just grateful to be reading this with everyone.
Thank you, Annabelle. Kristen?
Hi. So I am someone who was raised as a girl, female. So I have kind of a different perspective of, I actually am kind of like that uncle on the couch, but I am the other quote unquote gender, even though I'm non-binary now, so I don't identify as that, but that's how I was raised. And so thinking of like, you know, I worked a lot of like jobs, like in like food and like corporate, all kinds of like different areas. And honestly, like the idea of work, like that never felt, yes, I was like doing something for money, but it never felt like I was actually doing anything. I was just like going through the motions because it was what you're supposed to do. And I feel like now, even though I don't make any money and don't, you know, quote unquote work, I'm actually doing way more work now than I've ever done in my whole life, because I'm examining like myself and trying to like, and like examining the world around me and like questioning things and trying to understand things better and like read more and learn. Whereas I wasn't trying to do any of that before. I was just like a static, you know, being that was stuck and just like going through the motions, basically like kind of like a machine. So but I was also like, just for perspective, like I was raised like middle class, and my dad was like very much the person who like his whole identity was like work and being a dad and being a provider. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom, but then she also went to work like halfway when I was like in 5th grade. And although she didn't really want to, I think it did give her like some social connections to like other women, because she was a teacher, so there's a lot of other teacher friends she made. So I think that is also valid. But for me, it just never worked that way. I could never work at a job for like 35 years like my dad did and just like go through the motions and be like, whatever, it's fine. You know, and nothing made me feel like, yes, this is worth working for a company for them to pay me money, even if it was something I liked, like baking or like things like that. For me, like having to do it just like took all the joy out of it, and I couldn't enjoy it anymore, and it just felt oppressive. So I realized I have a lot of privilege to not work, but at the same time, it's interesting to think of, you know, the concept of work. What is work? You know, can work be fulfilling? Yeah, I really like the discussion. Just wanted to throw in my kind of unique perspective.
No, we appreciate that contribution. Wanted to make sure. Yes, please, T, share before. Oh, no, I guess they were. It said, was hoping to get to chapter 7 before I had to leave, but I'll just share this on my way out. This really hit me. When a culture is based on a dominator model, not only will it be violent, but it will frame all relationships as power struggles. Whew, a read. Okay, bye. Bye. Yes, ditto to that. And I wanted to share this before we moved on to the Feminist Manhood chapter, but towards the end of 102, I thought it was interesting as they talked about AA as a place where healing can take place for men. And, you know, I think about how many like women's circles I'm a part of or have been a part of, and how that's like a given for many women and femme experiences. But at the end, it says one man talks about how his female partner was turned off by his willingness to express feelings, to tell his story. In her eyes, this was a weakness. She insisted now that he was sober, he did not need to express these feelings anymore. And so that just made me think about this question of, you know, it sounds like there's this request for men to spend time with themselves and identify who they are and communicate their feelings, but then this resistance when that actually happens, or this, you know, kind of frantic energy that comes up. And I had and I can attest to that. I had an experience with my dad, and he started crying, and I was like, what is going on? Oof, oof, you know. And so this reminded me of that moment where, you know, in a different space, I might have felt really connected to his vulnerability, but it was frightening to me, honestly. So just wanted to share that and find out if anyone connected, and if not, we can move on to chapter 7.
Yeah, I'd love to respond to that. This book, it's just made me think so much about how I have internalized patriarchy. And so as you're saying that, I know like I've felt that way before. And yeah, so it just thinking about how like it's not, there's this great quote in there about this, but I can't remember which page it's on, but it's about how basically that it is systemic and that we can all carry it. But also just wanted to share this this other quote from chapter 7, if that's okay, kind of relates to this. Reformist feminist women could not make this call because they were the group of women, mostly white women with class privilege, who had pushed the idea that all men were powerful in the first place. These were the women for whom feminist liberation was more about getting their piece of the power pie and less about freeing masses of women or less powerful men from sexist oppression. And so it just made me think about how like how is my feminism about freeing all people and less about, you know, like how can I get more power and how can we get more power and like what does that look like? It just kind of expanded my mindset about that.
Thank you, Camille, for sharing that. Yes, that quote was the one that made me screech from my balcony that last week. Yeah, absolutely. There's so many moments where I'm like, ooh, scene, ooh, 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 this is uncomfortable. And then I know I'm going to be meeting with you all shortly after. So it's like, ooh. Is there, I'd love for us to open the floor up for folks to share things that resonated from chapter 7, Feminist Manhood. Aja, you're looking like you wanted to say something, and I'm having a hard time seeing, so jump in.
I just wanted to respond to what was just said, because I want to make sure that we all like mark that down, even for voices and like whatever we post up about the takeaways. Like that's just so crucial around how is my feminism about freeing all people rather than how can I attain more power. I think that's just brilliant. Like that's it. That's the question. And I think that one of the things we've noticed and the frustrations we've seen in a lot of the conversations that we are witnessing around, you know, like women empowerment and Black women and access and mobility, it's like, how do we empower women? Like all of the projects that I've seen that are about feminist, you know, principles or about like Black women or lifting up Black women, all of the narratives that I've seen is about empowerment, right? But what does empowerment mean? What does power mean? And why have we been so focused on power rather than liberation? And I think there's this assumption that power is that you need power, like in order, like I've always kind of had taken issue with the word power. And I know that there's something around that. I don't know what it is. I need to delve more deeper into it, but I do believe that power always felt very patriarchal to me. And I know that we try to flip it on in its head as women and say, you know, well, power is this and power is silence and power is feminine and power. But I'm like, the structure of power always felt like it was about dominating and like the ability to dominate. So I would really love if that be the one thing we come away with from this book club, right? Is like, one, how does everybody in this group really start to think about what does it mean to be a feminist? You know, what does it mean to be a feminist and to hold the title of feminist in this moment, in this era, in 2021? And then two, like how is our feminism about freeing people rather than just about power and feeling like we're getting more power? So I just wanted to highlight and thank you for bringing that up. I think it's so important. And as we move into the next section, I just hope that we like sit with that, because that's not something to just like let go. You know, it's really powerful to bring that into the conversation.
Totally, Aja. I love you for bringing that up. I see Ian would like to respond. Helena would like to respond to that. Yes. Okay. So Ian and Helena.
I already spoke, so if Helena would like to go first, I'm happy to follow.
Hey y'all. That was really beautifully said, Aja. I was thinking a little bit about what this book, there needs to be an update to this book, because I feel like some of the things that are discussed, I'm not know how to translate it, especially what's happening across like gender binaries and non-binary identities. But also the idea of, like, I think my favorite part of chapter 8 and just the overall book was what an equal partnership looks like, and like moving towards something. Like it's so easy to cancel something or bash something or look at the negative, but like working towards a vision, like using our imagination collectively as a group to think through what a new kind of dynamic looks like. So I don't have the quote right in front of me, but it's towards the end of chapter 8, and it was talking about mutual partnerships. And it was, you know, actually, I mean, I could scroll, but I'm on my phone. But I think that there was some text in there. There's some language around what like mutual responsibility looks like, what cooperation looks like. And so to echo your point, Aja, I think that like the idea of power, I think, can feel tricky. I've always thought of power as something inherently within all of us, like value, like we're all inherently valuable. We all come with that. Ego is a different thing that allows us to think that it's things outside of our control and dictate our power. But this idea of liberation and rest and cooperation and mutual responsibility and justice, putting justice above, I believe Bell Hooks, paraphrasing, but was talking about those who are motivated by justice rather than domination, right? Like, what is this? So I'm interested in thinking about what in 2021, particularly, this is almost, 20 years later after this book was written, where are we now? Where are we going? And how can we move the ship, meaning relationships, forward in a way that, like, what is the dream? So I'm just thinking out loud with you all.
Helena, I love dreaming. And Ian, I know you wanted to go, but I will forget this. And she highlights this, I think, it's chapter 7, maybe page 108 or something like that. But she talks about this idea of men hating, a resistance to imagining being that women still hate men, or this belief that women hate men. And And I was investigating for that myself and thinking about the need to forgive before I am able to really be in a space to imagine, and being honest with myself about, oh, I have some forgiveness that needs to take place before I can really jump into imagining this world where we're, where this can really happen. So I didn't articulate that super well, but hopefully someone caught it. Ian, want to make space for you to share as well.
Thank you very much. And I think part of my response to this is as a writer, I tend to look for trends in the zeitgeist and trends in culture kind of hidden within language. And I think with a lot of this question of labor and work, the phrase doing the work and how that relates to this concept of spiritual development is part of what's happening in terms of how we're reevaluating how we define work and the direction in which we're trying to move. And, I do healing work with a lot of healers, and which includes a lot of activists and artivists. And, part of the conversation that comes up with the woman identifying subset is this question of, is it, us getting caught up in the ways in which we're caught up at different levels with this question of male and female versus gender versus the masculine and feminine energies within all of us. And this question amongst women in particular, is it possible to be a woman with balanced masculine and feminine energies under patriarchy? And struggling with, kind of what this means in terms of the work that each individual soul is doing here, each individual person is doing here, as we work to evolve into a space in which we're capable of recognizing, moving beyond separation to recognizing this collective, the fact that everything that we do does affect everyone else. The kind of this amplified butterfly effect, which can be difficult, particularly to consider all the time, especially when we're caught up in like the density of history, right? And the history of racism and misogyny and imperialism and all of those things. And understanding that the relationship between oppressor and oppressed doesn't exclude us from recognizing that collective thread that we're all a part of, right? Within the web of power, however we feel about that. And for me, one thing that's been interesting to observe, and I'll wrap it up, is, what's been going on with the fungi on different levels, that around the world, there's been this explosion where everybody's so interested in fungi, and how this kind of mycelial aspect around the pandemic, where people are starting to get a greater sense of their connectedness to everyone else. And also how simultaneously there's this emergence of what's going on with fungi and psychedelics for those who are in that world, and how that's giving people a sense of the unity of which we're a part. And then people just even looking at it in terms of healing the body through medicine, and how fungi kind of connect an entire ecosystem, and they're kind of this vehicle of consciousness that connects everyone, including human beings, within that, and how we're all in these different ways being encouraged to do the work of balancing the masculine and feminine, because as Aja said, the impulse of the universe is always to create balance. Well, I'm not exactly quoting you, Aja, but the impulse of the universe is to move towards balance always. And how this kind of question of who we are and what we value, imploring us to ask that question about, how do I create greater balance amongst these energies, and how does that influence my environment and the collective?
Thank you, Ian. I have Tiffany, Helen, and then Kristen on stack.
Yeah, I mean, these are really great points. And I was trying to go back to, I think Helena mentioned kind of the last quote, which I underlined in chapter 7, about like nurturing, how this mutual partnership has to have a deal of nurturing. And so I guess what I'll share, not that great at sharing, so bear with me, but I started thinking a lot about work in the context of grieving. and rest. And that's what made me think about rest. So like I lost my mom, and she worked all her life. She worked for a manufacturing line, and it was all about work and how to pull yourself through work, pull yourself out of poverty. And she actually met my father, who passed, in a manufacturing line. So for me, I think the most masculine aspect of myself was stressing work and being productive. But when grief hit me, I had to rest. Otherwise, I was going to drive myself crazy. So I think it made me think about like men, like, okay, will men have to grieve what the patriarchy has done to them? Isn't that the first step? And like, how would that look like if they're not allowed to rest, if we're not allowed to rest, even women? And so that's why I think it's so important to me. I don't think that rest is not like, sitting and not working, but I think allowing yourself not to feel the need to always work, even when you can rest. If you feel the need to choose work, that's inherently the issue. And that's what I think a lot of people are realizing during this pandemic. And I think that's the hardest thing that I'm grappling with, is like that I have a privilege, I do, to rest, and I'm still finding ways to work, even though I'm grieving and I'm trying to actually do it. And I think it goes back to what men feel safe in AA, like meetings, because that is a time to rest. That is a form of resting, taking yourself out of this, capitalistic productive mindset and dealing with how you're feeling emotionally. And so I think like that's been the hardest, but most like, I guess, connecting thing that I can connect with men with, that I've learned from this chapter.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tiffany. Really appreciate that.
It's interesting how much AA is coming up on this conversation, because my uncle's like literally on his way to an AA meeting right now and has been going religiously for like the past 20 years or so. So really, really powerful healing space. I just wanted to quickly respond to a conversation that we were having earlier around freedom and power. And I think like I totally feel like that quote that you mentioned about how is my feminism about freeing more people is like so on point and like so key, like Aja was saying. And when I first started hearing about people using power within our movement, I was like very uncomfortable. I was like, like I was like feeling like this feels a little patriarchal, like why? It feels very masculine, I will say, and so it kind of felt a little bit uncomfortable for me. And then I also started to realize, like, I mean, I want our people, what I mean by freedom is like, I want our material conditions to change, and I want our people to have their basic needs met, shelter, food, water, education, etc. And in order to do that, I do think that you need power in order to like be able to make those decisions, to give all of those things to our people in order to like create the conditions for freedom. So like, I think there are many different types of power, but I think in some degree, we're gonna have to have some kind of institutional power in order to like make mass change for our people. So that's just like something that I wanted to like add into the conversation around that. And then, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Kristen? And then Aja.
Hi, so kind of along that line, the quote that I really liked is basically talking about the dominator model versus the partnership model. And she says, to offer men a different way of being, we must first replace the dominator model with a partnership model that sees interbeing and interdependency as the organic relationship of all living beings. It is the partnership model. In the partnership model, selfhood is always at the core of one's identity. in the partnership model, male identity would be centered around the notion of an essential goodness that is inherently relationally oriented. So I just thought this was interesting because a lot of like, when like earlier in my life, when I thought about like feminism, or even like racism or things like that, it's always like us versus them. Like, oh, women have to like take the power away from men and become the dominator. But she's saying basically, no, it's about giving up the idea of dominating anyone and seeing the like essential goodness of humanity that all beings have, and bringing that and bringing like everyone into that idea. And then I thought it could also relate to like all issues, you know, like instead of seeing other people as the enemy, seeing them as people, as fully human, and that need to be, you know, brought into this partnership model that she's talking about. And then when you're talking about grief, it really made me think of this other quote that said, men who are able to be whole, undivided, men who are able to be whole, undivided selves can practice emotional discernment because they are able to relate and respond rather than simply react. And that really resonated for me because I'm also
Can
reading.
you give the pages, please, for that, and the quote before?
Sure. It's I don't have the pages from the real book. It's 352 on my book, and the first one was 343 on my ebook, if that matters. But that really resonated with me also, because I've been reading My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem, and he talks a lot about trauma and how to process trauma and metabolize it to heal from it. And that when she says like, rather than simply react, reacting is basically a trauma response. And patriarchy is kind of like a trauma inflicted on not only men, but everyone, but like especially men. And that whole idea that, you know, we have to become whole first if we're ever going to achieve any kind of freedom or liberation. So that made me think of that when you're talking about grief.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
Yeah. Just Helen and team, I hope we're taking notes on that part. The dominator model versus the partnership model. I want us to definitely, that's gotta be in the solidarity toolkit for sure. But the other part I wanted to bring up about power, which I think ties to what was just said, is that when I look up what the etymology of power and like what it actually is supposed to mean, right? It's like the ability to act, the ability to do something or make something possible. And so that means like one has to have the strength, the might, or the will to make something, to be abled, you know? And I think the thing that I start to contemplate is like, what does that look like for people who are disabled? You know, this is where I've always felt like relationships are the foundation of our organizing, the foundation of how we move. And I, as someone who worked with Dream Defenders closely, organized that, they definitely tried to sell me on power, and I just still wasn't buying it. And I think the reason why I'm still not buying it is because the thing we have yet to be able to reconcile as a society is how do we care for and what agency do people who are disabled have in the conversation of willing the world the way they would like to see it, right? So that means that we need to be building on a relational scale of balance, and negotiating what we believe strengths are, because some people are not going to be able to force their will on others. There are some people who that's just not in them, that's not in their capacity, and that's what the struggle is, right? The struggle is, you know, I think there's a Palestinian revolutionary who was talking about like the struggle of the world has been the weak over the powerful. And so I think the conversation that I feel I'm always trying to reconcile my brain about what it means to be quote unquote feminine is that the feminine is always seen, or femme, you know, it's always seen as the weaker gender. We're seen as weak, not as powerful. And so I think what liberation looks like to me is exterminating power, exterminating the belief that one needs to force one's will in order for us to be able to cohabit life together, in order for us to be able to relate to each other. How do we start to connect to each other without the need to force our will onto someone, which I think is still that dominated, you know, model. And so if we're looking at an inner being, interdependent model, what does it look like to be disabled? What does it look like to be the person that is the quote unquote weaker? How do we create agency around that sort of sense of being in the world, that way of seeing the world? Because people, if we're going to get free the imagination of those who are abused and most oppressed and seen as the most weak, are going to be the imaginations that I think have the answers. But if that's the case, then the whole approach to what freedom looks like is going to have to change. And that's probably why I'm so resistant to power, because the assumption is, and I struggle with this, and I wonder if others are struggling with this, but the assumption is that in order for us to get free, there's going to have to be bloodshed, there's going to have to be violence, there's going to have to be, you know, force, and force implies power. And so I don't know. I think I'm grappling with that as someone that's like, well, what does a feminist approach or response look like to that conversation? And because I think we have a lot of men talking about power. We have a lot of men talking about power. And we have a lot of women who talk about power in relationship to men. But I don't know if we talk about what is the antidote to power. And maybe we don't think we need one, but I just feel like, yeah, I would love to hear what other people think about that.
Jameson, jump in.
And I think the thing that comes to my mind when we think about power is that it just seems that it's a zero-sum game. And so there's never going to be a place that is just equitable if that's the thing that we're fighting over. Because it's the idea was said earlier about what is a feminism that enables us for everyone to get free. And I don't know, power seems inherently problematic. Things what I've been kind of like contemplating on is like, because we have to imagine, like you were just saying, Aja, we have to imagine a new world, and that includes new ways of doing things and thinking. And so 3 things that I keep kind of like contemplating are, you know, cooperation, care, and mutual responsibility. And that is all tied into community, which is like another theme that keeps coming up, because that AA excerpt that I had underlined as well keeps coming up. The idea that men were able to finally feel seen in AA because they had community where they could be vulnerable, where they could, have the permission to feel. And I think all of this is tied together. So yeah, I think power is a zero-sum game, and it's problematic because of that. And I wonder what does care, cooperation, and mutual responsibility, what role is that? Is that a potential virtues or things that we should strive towards?
Yes. Thank you for that, Jameson. Holly?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jameson. And Asia, you inspired some pretty interesting thoughts for me as well, because I think that power, is something that we can look at from so many different angles, right? Like there are an infinite number of perceptions around it. And as someone who happens to be autistic with invisible and physical disabilities, I think this conversation reminds me of how interesting it is to hear theorists and even practitioners discuss what freedom looks like for disabled folks, opposed to asking us or putting us in positions where we get to decide. So yeah, I think, Asia, you made a really good point that we have to question where we're getting our definitions from and have the courage to dream of something new, because it's not linear, right? Like, I think it truly involves having conversations like this and reading books like this as well.
Holly, really appreciate that contribution. I see Camille also on the stack.
Thank you. I'm just so moved, Aja, by all that you said about power and just, I've never thought about it that way, where even the notion of power, there has to be someone underneath, and what does that mean? And it's making me think of this book called The Seat of the Soul by Gary Zukov. And actually in this book, I think she quotes Gary Zukov, but he talks about, because I think part of it is about maybe reframing power, like what does that mean? And he talks about authentic power, what he calls authentic power and inauthentic power. And this idea that power, inauthentic power is something that where you are perceived to have power over someone else, whereas authentic power is power over the self, and it's this deeper sense of power. And so, yeah, just wanted to add that to the conversation, that maybe there is a reclaiming of the beauty in power, and maybe that's actually maybe power is uplifting others, and what can that mean? But just thank you. I'm so moved by this conversation.
Def?
Yes. Yeah, something that I wrote down, and then there's something in the chapter on page 120 that I wanted to table, but something I wrote down was, I feel like this book is pointing out a design, and it's naming certain designs, whether that's capitalism or the dominator model, which serves capitalism, or capitalism serves the dominator model. Our responses, and like what this book is pointing out, these designs and our responses to the traumas that the designs manifest. And then I thought about designs, and I thought about our designs practices and how our practices enforced. And that got me to think, like, patriarchy is rewarded, and it's this practice, or these, like, it's enforced by violence. And then I think about powers and how do, like, in colonialism, how did someone come to power, right? Like, we even call it that. And it's these violences. And so what subverts violence? And I sit with this often, and then I think about what subverts that, what subverts the violence. And like, I think about beliefs, and belief, like, I was thinking about what it is that drives certain people to religions, like my parents are Seventh-day Adventists. And so they believe in the second coming of Christ. They believe that there is something that's going to set this right, and it is not of here, right? Like, that's their belief, and they want this deeply. And I believe in us here. That changes what's happening here. But we both are looking at this, almost this like what if the guns don't work one day? To think about how we could reorganize ourselves without these powers, this striving for. It's sort of like why I don't ever want to be a politician, because I don't believe in the design that they're operating in, even though I am very affected by it. So it's something that I toss and I turn with. But the thing that I wanted to talk about on page 120 was at the top when Terrence Real is talking to a Maasai wise man. And he says that he asked him, what are the traits of a good warrior? And so he said, I refuse to tell you what makes a good Morani warrior, but I will tell you what makes a good Morani. When the moment's called for fierceness, a good Morani is very ferocious. And when the moment calls for kindness, a good Morani is utterly tender. Now, what makes a good Morani is knowing which moment is which. And I feel like that's an attention to integrity, which is wholeness, which is no division of oneself and one's word. And I just wanted to like table that as like these practices, because these are designs, practices. So these are practices that we have to engage with thinking of cooperation models, these designs, these models. So that's where I'm feeling around.
Thank you, Def. And I realize I skipped over you, Ian.
No problem. Thank you. This is getting so juicy. I had a question for Aja, actually. Her thoughts on liberation as a form of power. And also, I wanted to add, which Def actually contributed to, this idea of plasticity, this idea that we get sick as a culture and neurotic and as individuals once our beliefs become rigid. And we actually see it in how brain synapses operate and things become fragmented, and trying to create more movement, right? The ability to move from the perspective of fierceness to a different one, to a perspective of tenderness, and men like this characteristic of males learning gentleness as a form of self-mastery. But I think along those lines, we tend to conceive of power and liberation. One thing they have in common, and how we often, some of us conceive of them is as static, not as these dynamic forces that we're continually in conversation with in terms of refining, and that meanings continue to shift as we move through experience and as we evolve into different levels of awareness and consciousness. And so power today doesn't necessarily mean what power might mean tomorrow. And liberation today might not mean what it means tomorrow. And those relationships are important because it keeps us present, right? It keeps us attentive. It keeps us from ossifying, because like what we see in like the cycles of the season and the seasons in nature is that it's constantly replenishing itself. It's like constantly dying and being reborn. That's what keeps nutrients in the soil. And I think some would argue that that's like this conversation between patriarchy and other systems as well. And just going real back before I shut up for a minute, one thing that occurred to me is this idea of patriarchy itself as being a trauma response, particularly because it is so neurotic, and it is, it's on the extreme end of neurosis, I think. So I'll just leave it there. But I did have that question for Aja, because I'm curious how she would respond to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think to me, liberation isn't a location or a place. Like, I think it's a process. And I feel like people, wherever we're working towards, people have to be able to determine themselves. We have to create a sort of society where people can determine themselves, where people have the access to self-determination. And I think that for me, I believe in ability, and I believe in will, and I believe in protection and trust, and like, I believe in nature. I believe in nature, and knowing that liberation is not a trickle down theory. It's It's material, it's physical, it's spiritual, it's the fruition of one's journey into self-determination. So I think a society that creates more room for people to be able to determine themselves is a free society, is the closest thing to a free society we can hope for. I think people having, you know, forcing and fixing for people to live a certain way, creating conditions by which things continue to happen a certain way, to me is a cycle of oppression. And that is when power feels like it's forcing us or exerting us to be predetermined to move a certain way. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot that I'm processing in this conversation. And more times than not, what I love about the feminine, what I've learned from the feminine is that chaos and messiness and confusion and flow and improvisation is a part of that process, that it's not something we run away from, it's something we lean into, and it's something that we investigate, and that we find ourselves, you know, in awe of, rather than the need to constantly always categorize and put labels on everything and make everything fixed so that it can then be easier for us to digest or us to relate to. And so I think as we start to relate to the messy, as we start to relate to the messy in ourselves, and to really honor who we are in ourselves, then I think we can honor other people. But that's the closest I think we'll get to freedom. I don't know, you know, and I don't think it's not a state. It's like, just like happiness is not a state, love is not a state. It's an action, it's active, and it needs to be in movement always.
Thanks for posing that question, Ian, and thanks, Aja, for your response. Annabelle wanted to make space for you.
Something that Aja had shared just before this was about, you asked the question, I believe, like, what's the opposite of power? And then we kind of, as we started to unpack like what power might mean and reading some of the things in the chat that people shared, I'd be thinking like, what's the opposite of domination? Which is basically a tangent to what you were asking. And I've been thinking a lot about compassion lately. We saw a interview with Alok Menon, who's a non-binary person, in conversation with people about like what it's like a podcast that the narrators are, it's called Man Enough, but some of the insight that Alok brought to that conversation was just absolutely stunning and incredible. And they talked about compassion as kind of this anecdote. And so I shared that with another friend of mine, and named Rhea. And what she brought to my attention was that she had read something about like the science of, I think it was of compassion itself, or of hope. It was of hope. And so, yeah, she said that in that book, they discussed that compassion, that like a lot of times people look to liberate people through empathy, which can be really draining and is not sustainable. But instead of empathy, if we have compassion, it's really regenerative and it's nourishing in both directions. So I thought of possibly compassion as an opposite of domination, but
Jeff, were you wanting to say something? Like your mouth was moving. No. Okay, I think I saw was that Tiffany? Yes. You're on mute, love.
Thank you. I just wanted to provide like a little bit more of a tangent on power in the context of nature as well. And not to bring up a dead white guy, but Darwin, we all know Darwin as someone who came up with survival of the fittest, but I think the theory stops at there, and then we injected that in the worst ways into our society. But he did have another book about this phenomena that he saw in animals about cooperation and compassion. And I think that like when it comes to power, just going off Annabelle's point, it can always be, even in the like harshest environments, you see these like, you know, beautiful moments of animals cooperating. And I think that's always going to combat this need for power, is this need to come together for something. And whether it be survival, which hopefully we don't get to that point, but that will show how compassionate we can be as a society. But also, you know, as intelligent creatures, we do have the ability to do that without being in the harshest environments, without having the harshest stressors on us. It, you know, it makes me think, I thought about just, yeah, like just as wildfires are kind of, are disastrous, but then have this beautiful consequence of resetting the soil. I almost wish that we could do that with some of these old ideas, these old conventional wisdoms. And this is just my mindset from based off what I'm reading, but of just setting fire to some of these things, so that we can kind of renew the soil of what we think is power. So I'm rambling a little bit, but that's, you know, based off what's been said, that's what keeps coming to mind, is this, the power can come through a shared cooperation.
Thank you, Tiffany. Christian?
I think and overthink about the idea of power and relationships. I think a lot in terms of how do you explain this to a 5-year-old? How do you explain this to, or like in my case, my 4-year-old, some of y'all may remember River. She sends her love to the group. You know, how do I teach her about being equitable in power at a young age? And how do I make it digestible to somebody coming out of like a really hurt relationship, and how to like heal for their relationship with themselves as well as relationships with other people? Because perhaps what they're going to have to really get down to the nitty gritty is what type of power they asserting to battle and at what given time. And to me, I think one of the most important things, it's really about like accountability. When you are taking too much power and somebody is doesn't like it, they need to be able to like either like communicate that and trust that that communication will actually come back to you. Because, you know, that's one thing that constantly comes back to my head is like, honesty is a heartbeat of love, right? If this is about love and it's about honesty, then it's really about the ability to trust that whatever like power is being dispersed, because some people want the power because their partner will their table and they really want a decent deal along. So I think one part is that accountability, because I think somebody said it last week where, you know, cancel culture versus council culture. Thinking about like now with the baby, like what do the dynamics look like in real time whenever his hatred, whether it be ignorant or not, is literally being taken away from the person? How is he reacting and how is he being counseled? And how are we showing up to have the conversation? So I say all that to say, you know, I think the more focus on what accountability looks like whenever power dynamics do shift or communication is offset, because ultimately that can be the you know, the roots of racism and sexism and all these other things. But I do think this is such a critical piece about how to teach kids at a young age, and then make sure that we as adults are reinforcing positive communication around it as well. Thanks.
I have one more thing to add. Can you guys hear me? Sorry, my thing froze for a second.
Yeah, we can hear you. Girl.
Okay, cool. So this book has been coinciding with like a lot of personal work that I've been doing at the time. And this question of power, the desire to like inflict will upon another person, has been coming up for me in my therapy and in this book. And just noticing, one, I want to acknowledge that there's a bunch of different ways in which domination occur. I think sometimes I used to think of it as almost always like brute force. And I had to kind of restructure that idea, because there are ways in which like manipulation and things that are much more subtle and less aggression based are considered, or could be considered, a form of domination. Like in my own life, like my version of people pleasing and this like trying to be like perfect for people to like me and be nicer to me or whatever is a way of manipulating and trying to inflict my will upon someone else in some way. And so in acknowledging that, I was just kind of thinking about how this structure that we live under, it really deems us powerless. So then it makes us rigidly cling to these kind of like defense mechanisms, which are ways that we hold on to control within our individual lives as some way of resistance to the lack of control we have in the broad spectrum of things. And it made me question whether or not the desire to dominate, like, or the desire to be powerful, does that come from, would oppressed people, marginalized people and oppressed people, would we desire to dominate if we did not experience domination? Would we desire to have power over others if we didn't have that inflicted upon us? And I think people all the time, like I had this conversation with a guy and he like referenced alpha males and, you know, like that shit existing in nature and how that is like just a social interaction between mammals. But then I researched that even, and the alpha male term comes from like this study that a guy did on wolves. And he realized about 10 years afterwards that he was doing it on wolves in captivity. So the way that the behavior that he witnessed in them was literally coming, it was kind of a defense mechanism for them. It was coming out of a desperation. They were in captivity, they weren't existing freely. And when he researched them in their free natural habitat, he realized that it is not alpha male energy in these animals was less about domination and more about like there was an alpha male and a female, two parents essentially, who led a pack of their children through life essentially. And that's why they were leaders, but they didn't dominate. They didn't aggressively force people like other wolves to follow them or anything like that. But obviously this is after pop culture had already ran with the title and then it, you know, became associated with all of this stuff. So that question of whether or not domination is a natural desire, if it is something that we would feel if it was not inflicted upon us, if it was even something that we would know if we didn't experience it, is just something I've been thinking about during this entire, like reading this book, and you know, hopefully y'all think about it too. But that's all.
You're not gonna scoot out with that mic drop and that whole explosion that I feel like so many of us had about like, wait, what? Thank you for that, Kayla. Want to make space for anybody to respond to that, and then would love to transition because we just have about 10 more minutes left for takeaways that folks have had from our time together today.
Wait, Hollis, who are we letting go next?
Anybody.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
letting folks share any final quotes or respond to what Kayla said. And then I was going to make space for us to transition into takeaways. But if there's no response, we can transition into takeaways from today now.
Yeah, is that anyone? Because you know that silence can be deafening. Anybody else want to share?
Kristen does.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, it just made me think of the part where Bell Hooks talks about how the idea that males are like all powerful and how that's actually a myth, but how only like middle class and upper women like really believe that because that they see that in like their actual lives. And I definitely like was taught to like basically fear all males because like they had the power to harm me, whatever. And so I think part of the reaction to like want to then like have power over stems from that like false idea of powerlessness that is like socially prescribed to marginalized peoples. And like personally for me, what has made me feel more powerful is actually not having control over other people, but to like feel my own sense of like agency and like yeah, like agency and will and self-determination as like no, like that's a lie. Like men aren't all powerful and I'm not powerless if they try to do something to me. Like I can speak up, I can act in defense, like, and if something does happen to me, it's not like a shameful terrible thing that's on my shoulders, which is another thing that I think society kind of like puts that fear into people, that like yeah, if something happened then I would just have to heal from that. And you know, but it's not like not in the shame of like silence or anything like that. So yeah, it just really made me think of how I used to feel about like this kind of terror around like them over there, they're very scary, and then like gradually unlearning that and being like, oh, that's actually a lie.
Thank you for that, Kristen. So I wanted to make space for Aja or Kayla or Helen to just share any takeaways that they've had and then open it up to the rest of the floor from our time together before we close out. Kayla, you unmuted. Were you about to share something?
And however, someone did write in the chat this as well, but what Def said earlier about an artist's job. Christian, do you mind muting yourself?
I'm sorry.
I don't know. Thank you. So yeah, what Def said earlier about an artist's job, that really invigorated me. And definitely, because like sometimes in reading about this stuff and just kind of doing the work, asking these questions, it can be a little discouraging to acknowledge the loop of what we are in and how effective really this system is working against us. So that just what he said about it being the artist's job to ask that questions, and that is part of the work, and it really just kind of like reminded me and invigorated me to continue in that process, which was wonderful.
Thank you. Aja, did you have something? Great. Anyone else have anything before we close out? I know the conversation around power is resonating heavily for me, and it feels like I see a lot of heads nodding, and kind of the bulk of our conversation was spent around that and how we might define that and explore what that looks like, especially as we put the piece together. And just grateful for us being able to share the space together this afternoon or this evening if you're on the East Coast. We will come back together. Pardon me. We'll come back together on the 25th for chapters 8 and 9. But thank you everyone for your thoughtful comments and just your vulnerability, sharing your own experiences. This is such a wonderful space, and it's so great to be in community with all of you. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and see you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Peace, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
you.
I think because the stuff crashed for Helen, it's now has Kristen as the host. So I don't know how that happened, but
Yeah, I just noticed that. I was like, it says end. Do you want me to end it?
yeah, you totally
Okay.
can. All right, thanks everyone.